Everyone, thank you for joining us today. As Kevin mentioned, my name is Chris Beadling, and I have the honor of being PAR's 2022 president. Before I go any further, allow me to thank Chris Rad for pinch hitting on me for our last webinar earlier this month, and also a big shout out to our commercial PAR members who participated in the NAR C5 Summit last week in New York. So I am so thrilled to be able to host this particular webinar today, talking about 1031 like-kind exchanges in Pennsylvania. Now, 1031 exchanges aren't exactly breaking news. In fact, realtors in the 49 other states have probably done similar webinars many times. But I'm thrilled that we are doing this one right here, right now, because that means the efforts of PAR and our members over the past several years to urge lawmakers to adopt 1031s into Pennsylvania's tax structure finally succeeded. Just weeks after more than 175 realtors visited the Capitol in June, 1031s were finally approved, and the governor signed the legislation, which became Act 53, opening the door to even more investment, redevelopment, wealth building, and job creation. So definitely my thanks to everyone who advocated for this change. With me today is Margo McDonnell, President and CEO of 1031 Corp. Margo is a certified exchange specialist with more than 20 years of experience in the 1031 exchange industry. She's been an advocate on behalf of the 1031 exchange industry, spearheading efforts to launch a national certification and continuing education program for exchange practitioners, and serving as the founding chair of the Certified Exchange Specialist Certification Council of the Federation of Exchange Accommodators, which is the National Trade Association for Exchange Practitioners. In 2003, she was presented the first ever FEA President's Award, and in 2008, she was honored with the Margo McDonnell Certified Exchange Specialist Perpetual Award for Outstanding Service by the CES Certification Council. She's also served on the local board of directors of the Tri-County Suburban Realtors and is just a wealth of knowledge for all of us here in Pennsylvania. So, Margo, first of all, not many of us have an award that's named after us, let alone have such a great reputation in all those trade association and councils that I just listed. So thank you for being on board with us, and welcome.
Thanks, Chris. I'm happy to be here and share the news about 1031.
Absolutely. So let's jump into it. Let's start off by noting that it's been quite a while that PAR has been working to get the state to recognize 1031 like-kind exchanges. And as we've both just said in the first couple minutes here, we've both been working on this for quite some time. And I guess the place we need to start is for all the members that are on this call. Why don't we start by explaining what a 1031 like-kind exchange really is?
Sure, Chris. So it gets its name from Section 1031 of the Internal Revenue Code, and it allows that the seller of a business use or investment property can defer the gain when they sell one and they reinvest everything in another one. So it's really just like the sale of one investment or business use property followed by the purchase of another, linked together by the necessary documentation and completed within a 180-day period.
So hopefully many of us are having flashbacks to pre-licensing or broker licensing class right now, remembering this section about 1031 exchanges. So I guess the big question is, why is that tax deferral so important?
Well, the great thing for property sellers is rather than paying the tax now, they get to reinvest those pre-tax dollars into their replacement property, so that money will continue to appreciate for them. And they not only have the ability to diversify the type of property that they're purchasing or the location of the property, they can buy something with greater cash flow, something that perhaps is easier to manage. They can sell one property and buy 3 properties. So there's a ton of flexibility with what they can do with that.
Great. So we heard for years from all our commercial real estate practitioners that their developers and investors basically were avoiding doing business in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania because we were the only state that didn't allow 1031s. So I know many of us have talked about this, but really, why was that such a deterrent in coming to this state?
So the big issue was that you could defer the federal gain, but not the state income tax. And not only could you not defer the state income tax, but you couldn't exclude any money from the sale to pay the Pennsylvania tax. So for individuals, it's a flat rate of 3.07%. And for corporations, it was 9.9%. And that meant that you had to take all the equity from your old property, put it into your new property, and then take the money out of your pocket to pay the Pennsylvania tax, or you would have had the whammy of paying the federal tax on the 3% you paid to Harrisburg, or 9%.
I have to admit, that is the part that I learned during this advocacy process, was that if you took any proceeds from the sale to pay off Pennsylvania, you actually triggered a capital gains tax in Washington that everybody in all the other states in the country were not dealing with. So exactly. I can see, if I were a property investor, why I might want to stay out of this state as well. So in your personal practice, how many clients did you see that were wanting to invest in Pennsylvania, but were penalized for doing so?
Well, obviously we're based in Pennsylvania, so probably half of our clients are in Pennsylvania or own a property in Pennsylvania. And it affected anyone who owns property in Pennsylvania, regardless of where you were located, or anyone that lives in Pennsylvania, or a corporation that is based in Pennsylvania that sells property anywhere else in the US. And for us, it was, probably half of all of our clients were in Pennsylvania and they had to pay that tax. And, when it comes to those who don't live in Pennsylvania, or their businesses aren't based in Pennsylvania, when they look at the exit strategy, knowing that they would have to pay those capital gains, that's when they said, I'll just avoid Pennsylvania, because if I buy in New Jersey or New York or one of these states near it, I wouldn't have to pay that state tax when I sell, and I could take all of my proceeds and roll it in if I bought something else somewhere else.
Unbelievable that we were the last ones and people were avoiding us just for that reason.
Exactly.
which is a shame for practitioners who lost business. So I'm thrilled that we can do this now. Recently, you mentioned in a just listed article that there are several misconceptions, though, about 1031, especially with residential real estate professionals. What is one or two misconceptions that we should bring to light here on this call?
Sure, Chris, I think the biggest one is the misconception that this is only for commercial real estate. The fact is, across the country, about 2/3 of all 1031 exchanges involve a single family home owned by somebody like you or I. And for most people, it's their biggest investment outside their primary residence. They're selling it for under $500,000, and they have, $200,000, $300,000 gain in that property. So the biggest thing to remember is any type of business use or investment property qualifies. So those single family rentals are definitely the ones that we see the most, not just 1031 Corp, but across the country, all the qualified intermediaries.
Yeah, I will tell you, that's one of the things, even just in local discussion with other realtors, they always think when we talk about 1031 that we're talking about giant industrial warehouses, and that's where this whole thing plays out. But so many of them are single family investment properties that people are not taking advantage of it. And I guess the reason why some people don't take advantage of it is that realtor members tend to think that it's difficult. Can you just sort of, first of all, you can talk about 1031 Corp, but second of all, can you just sort of put to bed that misconception that doing this process is so hard to do?
Sure, Chris. When someone does a 1031 exchange, they need to use an independent party called a qualified intermediary. And that's the role I play in the transaction. 1031 Corp, we serve as that qualified intermediary, and we handle all the exchange documentation. We coordinate all the details with the closing agent. We keep our clients aware of all the time deadlines. We make sure that all the funds are at closing when they're ready to buy that replacement property. And what the importance of that all is to the real estate professional is we're going to take care of all the 1031 details so you can do what you do best, and that's to get your client to the closing table. In my opinion, right now, with this real estate market, you have the hardest job because you have to help them find the replacement property, but you don't have to worry about all the 1031 details because that's really the role of the qualified intermediary. The important thing that I would suggest is when you're taking the listing or when you're entering into that agreement of sale, bring up 1031 right then, because it gives them, it encourages your clients to go talk to their tax advisor about 1031, find out if it's a good thing for them, and then start looking for replacement property right away before any time clocks are clicking.
Yeah, so that, I mean, quite honestly, one of the things that makes us more professional, and thankfully all the people on this call, is that we need to know when the possibility really exists for 1031 beforehand.
That's exactly right. I would suggest anytime you're listing a property, if it's not someone's primary residence, at least bring it up. The only time it doesn't work is if it's their primary residence, or if they're flipping a property, it's a spec home, anything considered inventory. Or most vacation homes don't work on the surface, but sometimes with a little bit of planning, those vacation homes can work. So if you're taking that listing agreement, you generally know how they've used the property. And if it hasn't been their primary residence, encourage them to talk to their tax advisor about it. And they can initiate that exchange all the way up to, well, we hope it's not always the norm, sitting at the closing table. You know, ideally, they're going to let us know weeks in advance once they sign the agreement of sale. But if somebody were to be sitting at a closing table with you and say, Chris, remember when I entered into that listing agreement, you told me about 1031? I think I want to do it. We can make that work before all the funds are dispersed and everyone walks out. But if you call me after closing and say, hey, Margo, I have someone, there's nothing I can do at that point in time.
So that was going to be my very next point. Once you step away from the closing table, it's too late for this, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So again, it's important for our members to recognize how 1031 works. As I joked earlier, flash back to that day in pre-licensing education when you heard about this thing called the 1031, brush up on your skills, and now that it's in Pennsylvania, take advantage of the advantage. So we started talking about this a little bit, but what types of properties do you think are eligible in the 1031 exchange?
So where everyone calls, and you even started the conversation with like-kind exchanges. And like-kind is just a really confusing term. It refers to the nature or the character of the property, not the specific type of property. So any kind of property is likely eligible for 1031 treatment as long as it's held for business use or investment. So it can be vacant land. It could, in fact, in Pennsylvania, we do countless exchanges for farmers, but it could be vacant land. It could be those single family rentals. It could be any type of commercial property. But it could be some things you haven't thought about earlier, like conservation easement, some oil and gas royalties, mineral rights, air rights, water rights. You know, if you and I own a property as tenants in common, let's say we bought a property in the Poconos and we took title as Margo and Chris, tenants in common, and I want to sell my 50% to you, I can do that through a 1031 exchange.
Oh, that's a cool concept. Yeah, absolutely. Tenants in common, sharing out of one getting out halfway out. Yeah, okay. So maybe this just throws a new wrinkle into my next question. Who tends to utilize the 1031s the most? Mom and pop, farmers, you just mentioned, tenants in common. Where is it most likely that you'll see the 1031 exchange?
We see individual taxpayers as the most frequent exchangers. While we do plenty of transactions for commercial real estate professionals, commercial real estate owners, and they tend to own it in a partnership or an LLC, what happens is 2/3 of all those properties are owned by individuals. And even some of those commercial properties are owned by individuals that form a single member LLC to hold that property. So I would say a good 2/3 of our property, 2/3 to 3/4 of our properties are owned by individuals, either directly in their name or through a disregarded entity like a revocable living trust or a single member LLC.
Okay. And so one of the things that I hear a lot is, how about realtors? Can they, for their own property, can they engage in 1031?
Absolutely. You'd be crazy not to consider it. In reality, anyone who is selling a property that's been held for business use or investment should at least look at whether or not a 1031 exchange makes sense. Because you can not only defer the gain now on the state and the federal level, but you can also defer the depreciation recapture. So all that depreciation you've taken over the last 10 years that you've owned the property, or 20 years, typically you have to recapture that at 25%. And when you do a 1031 exchange, you can defer that as well as the capital gain taxes.
That's awesome. So in your practice, is there a group of property owners that you see who are usually the most aware, or most not aware, that the 1031 could benefit them? In other words, who should we be looking to give the most assistance to?
I would say the ones that tend to find out that don't know about 1031 are the ones that only own 1 or 2 investment properties, and it just hasn't been on their radar. And if they've never discussed it with their tax advisor, or haven't mentioned the possibility of selling this property, then there was really no one to give them the advice to consider 1031. So that's why I always think the real estate professional is in the ideal position to bring it up, because you know about 1031, you know it's been used as an investment or a business use property. So right when you're taking your listing agreement, or you first meet them about selling a property, that's the time to bring it up. And I just think that's what you should, think about when you're taking those listings, or you're talking to someone about selling a property. And think about all the people that you have sold investment properties to, especially in the last couple of years. They may not know about 1031. And, think about a way to reach out to them and let them know about 1031, and to reach out to you when they eventually want to sell that property.
Okay, great. And so as realtors, we tend to be really critical path kind of thinkers. So step me down the critical path. I've just had this conversation with my listing client, and I think this property could be eligible for the 1031 exchange. I know my first step is to call Margo, but beyond that, as a realtor in Pennsylvania, what are the steps that they should take as soon as they think their client's transaction is eligible for that 1031 exchange?
So I would bring it up right away, as we talked about. But once you put that property under contract, that's a good time to follow up, because you are now on a path to closing. And once closing happens, that's when their time clock starts clicking. So realistically, from the time you sign the agreement of sale until you get to closing, we're thinking, 30, 45 days to get to that point. So that's 30 to 45 days that, if they're interested, they can be looking at potential replacement properties, so that once their closing happens and their time clock starts clicking, you already have that all lined up. And so, I always, my path is always bring it up at the listing, but then really get serious about it, and ask them, make sure you talk to your tax advisor. What do you want to do once you enter into that agreement of sale? And when I think that you should reach out to a qualified intermediary is once that agreement of sale has been signed, because there's a title agent somewhere out there who's building a file, and we want to make sure they have the 1031 information as early as possible. But, with this crazy real estate market, I can't stress the need to start looking for property as soon as possible enough.
Yeah, that is a great point. I mean, even with replacement property market slowing slightly, it's still something that you want to make sure you have on there. And you probably said this in the beginning when you were talking about the definition of a 1031, but just for everyone's benefit, will you outline the timetables again?
Sure. So you have 2 time periods, and they both start the day you transfer title to your buyer. From that point in time, you have 45 days to identify in writing property you're interested in purchasing, and running at the same time, you have 180 days to actually buy everything that you want to buy. So you really have until midnight of the 45th day. And while you don't need to have a property under contract in order to identify it, we're all realistic. And we know that if we listed a property today on our 45-day identification and it's not under contract, we probably have a greater chance of not getting it than getting it right now. So really try to get it under contract, even though it's not required for the 1031 rules.
So probably I'm going to guess that we have Realtor members from pretty much every county in Pennsylvania on this call right now. And one of the things that they're going to ask themselves is, where can I find a qualified intermediary that can help my clients? Now, I know in the introduction, we talked about 1031 Corp. We talked about your experience. Is that something that you're doing across the entire Commonwealth, or should they be looking for a qualified intermediary that's closer to home?
So Chris, our company handles exchanges all over the country, but anyone can find a qualified intermediary through the Federation of Exchange Accommodators website. And that domain or that website is just www.1031.org. And you can just search Pennsylvania in there. There's not a ton of us in Pennsylvania, but there are a few of us.
Well, we have one of the best right here. So
thank you.
Kevin, hopefully you can throw 1031.org in the chat for everybody. And at this point, it sounds like we have some questions from our audience. So we're going to throw it open to them and see what we have.
Yeah, so we've got a few here. So Margo, specifically on the 1031, you mentioned it does apply to raw or vacant land, as in development of building lots. So if a developer sells several lots, but not all of the lots, could he apply the 1031 in a new raw land purchase?
So if a developer is selling some building lots, then that doesn't work for 1031 treatment. It's only for property held for business use or investment. For that developer, that's their business. So when they sell those lots, that's considered inventory, and IRS is going to assess ordinary income tax on that sale. So if it were somebody who was a real estate investor who owned building lots, constructed improvements, and then sat on those for a number of years while they were rented, then they could 1031 it.
Okay. A couple questions on location. So you mentioned obviously on working with an intermediary, and you work across the Commonwealth, but specifically on the land itself. So could somebody sell in New Jersey and buy in Pennsylvania, or vice versa?
Yes, that's the great part of 1031, that flexibility. You can buy and sell anywhere in the US. Perfect. And you could sell more than one or buy more than one. So if I've had someone sell a piece of farmland in New Jersey and buy 53 replacement properties, I was like, oh, won't farming the land be easier than managing 53 properties? But then I had somebody else who had accumulated, I think it was 75 or 77 condos in one large condo community over, a 20-year period, and then sold them as a package to buy one property.
So lots of different options out there for buyers.
Yes.
Okay. So back on some stipulations. So, can a 1031 work if the property's been inherited? I guess, is it similar to the investment line item there?
Kevin, that's a great question. What I would talk to somebody about in that situation is, how long ago did you inherit that property? Because when you inherit a property, you get a step up in basis, meaning that you inherited at the fair market value at the time of death. So that would become your new basis. So you would pay tax on anything over and above that price. So depending on if it's in the last couple of years, we know that property values have skyrocketed. So it may still make a lot of sense, but sometimes it doesn't. You don't have to do a 1031 exchange because there's not much gain there because you inherited with that step up in basis. But you would have to wait a period of time. We talked a lot about like kind, but what makes it, what we didn't touch on is the same taxpayer requirement. Whoever owns the old property has to own the new property. So that's one thing. And the other thing is holding period. Well, the regulations don't define a set holding period. You do want to have reported it on your tax return for at least a year or two to show that it was your property and you owned it for business use or investment. So hopefully that answers your question about acquiring.
Got it. We had a few comments and questions come in when you reiterated the timelines again. So a little bit on finding the replacement property. So what if you've identified a replacement property first and you haven't actually gone under an agreement on selling your initial property?
So you can do what's called a reverse 1031 exchange. It gets a little bit tricky, and anyone who's ever taken a CE class that I've done in Pennsylvania, when we talk about Pennsylvania, I've always said, hey, when it comes to 1031, Pennsylvania is the worst state. And for this question, I'm going to continue to say that Pennsylvania is still a bad state. So with a reverse exchange, what happens is you can't own both properties at the same time. Otherwise, you don't have an exchange. So in a reverse 1031 exchange, your qualified intermediary or an affiliate of that qualified intermediary can form an LLC, for example, or a disregarded entity to take title to your new property directly from the seller. We do that using money that you loan to us or a combination of money from you and a third-party lender. And we can hold title for up to 180 days. That gives you 180 days to sell your old property to a buyer, and then we transfer the property that we've parked to you. The downside is in Pennsylvania, we have double realty transfer taxes. So oftentimes those additional transfer taxes could eat away all the benefits of doing the 1031 exchange. So it's an option, but I would love to run some numbers with you before you pull the trigger on that.
Got it. On the timeline comments again, how long does a seller have to hold the property prior to selling before a 1031 might be effective for them?
So I like to use that 1 to 2 years as a good rule of thumb, but it's not written in stone. So for example, I had someone, this goes back to the last crazy real estate market, but I had someone sold a property in May at the Jersey Shore, had owned it for 20 years or so, bought another property a few weeks later, held it for this summer. And at the end of the summer in August, he called me and said, Margo, what do I do? Because somebody wants to buy this property that I just bought in May. And it was hundreds of thousands of dollars in profit in that very short period of time. And we got on the phone with his accountant and we looked at the whole picture, and he owned the old property for 20 years. He, intended to hold this long term. It was an unsolicited offer. He was doing everything right. And we talked about, what is your next step? He said, I want to own an investment property in Stone Harbor. That's what I want to do. So the accountant suggested that he go ahead and do the 1031 exchange, even though it was that relatively short holding period. So don't get hung up with the time periods as long as you're doing everything right. As long as you have the track record, it's been reported on your taxes. Think about before you how long you've owned it. What if IRS were to audit you? What is the picture that you're going to paint to them? So keep that in mind.
Got it. So I think when you were talking about some of your examples of some of your recent exchanges you've worked with, I think these questions it prompted a couple questions. Does the replacement property have to be of the same type of property, i.e. land for land or residential to residential, and or the quantity that I think you had talked about as well. So going from 1 to 75 or vice versa.
Right. No, that's the great thing, all that flexibility. So any kind of real property held for business use or investment will work. So you can sell land and buy a single family home. You can sell a shopping center and buy an office building. Tons of flexibility there. You can sell 1 and buy 4. You can sell 7 and buy 3. There's no caps on anything.
Got it. Scrolling through, there's a few all along the same topic lines that you've already covered here.
Well, while you're
Chris,
doing
you
that,
go
Kevin,
right ahead.
while you're doing that, I'm going to jump back in here and say that Pennsylvania realtors are such awesome rock stars, because all of the questions that you guys are all asking Margo are so much more in-depth and terrific than some of the ones that I had written down ahead of time. So I love that you're engaging. Keep asking your questions whenever we do these webinars. And let's see, Kev, did you find another?
Yeah, so a lot of these are very specific, and so I would encourage what Margo is saying of either reaching out directly to Margo or some of the other intermediaries. What we will do is include a link to the 1031.org to find intermediaries, and obviously Margo's contact information for any specific follow-up questions, because we certainly want to be careful on some of the questions you all have asked are great questions, however, not appropriate for a public webinar at this point. We actually have 2 questions on REITs. Are those appropriate within a 1031 conversation?
So unfortunately, you cannot buy into a real estate investment trust as replacement property. Real estate investment trust or REITs do 1031 exchanges all the time when they're buying and selling properties, but we can't buy into them as replacement property because really you're investing in a fund or buying stock, and that's not the same as real property.
Got it. International. Does any of this apply to international property sales, and what property sold in another country or client wants to purchase in the US?
So yes, actually you can exchange foreign property, but it gets a little bit tricky. So 1031 allows you to exchange domestic property for domestic property or foreign property for foreign property held for business use or investment. But unfortunately, you cannot sell foreign property and buy domestic property. So if your client owns the property outside the US, they can exchange, but they have to buy another property outside the US. I would say that's probably the 1031 rule that makes the least amount of sense to me. Why won't they let you just bring your money back to the States? But they don't.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Margo. I think that's a good summary of a lot of these, and everybody that did ask questions, we will follow up, with all of the information that I mentioned here today and recording of today.
Terrific. And I'm gonna echo Kevin's thanks, Margo. This is phenomenal that we have this wealth of information available to us right here in Pennsylvania. Some of us who have done CE with you already know how great it is, but I have a feeling this cycle, now that 1031 is back in Pennsylvania, that you will start to see more of them. Just a reminder for everybody that we've been talking about the Pennsylvania legal changes or legislative changes. That doesn't start until January 1st. So if you have a 1031 that's getting ready to close in the back half of 2022, recognize those are still governed under the old 1 out of 49 or 1 out of 50 states rules. So hopefully you can push those out into 2023 when it makes more sense. So Margo, again, our thanks. For all of our members, be on the lookout. Our next PAR webinar is on Tuesday, September 13th in recognition of Realtor Safety Month, and we will be getting more information out to you very shortly. You guys enjoy your Monday, and thank you again.
Thank you.